Otherwise, LeBron will shoot me. Great. All right. So, DC, you had an announcement?
Yeah, let me just share the screen here. I was on Shapeways today, and can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, that's the B&O powder car. So you can now, if you're modeling an HO, get one or more of those through Shapeways.
Nice.
And then the other car that I'll tell you, let me go back here. The shop is by Graham Model Works for the B&O car, and then DMS Engineering. They're making this, and it's called a for the U.S. military railroads. So,
wow.
If anybody's ever seen a car like that, I would be interested in seeing that photo.
DC, what was that place again? The DS something?
DMS Engineering for this car.
Okay.
And the B&O powder cars were
Fram.
BARM, B-A-R-M Model Works.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop this now.
Great.
That was my little bit of announcement.
So just a couple of snippets. One is DC and I were down at Timonium train show on Saturday because he found out about this guy that does 3D scans. So we came down there in garb, and we each had 2 scans done. He sits you on a little pedestal that turns around and moves the camera up and down, and he 3D prints you in the scale that you want. So I had a couple done, DC had a couple done. So for those of you that are going to be here for the ops session this month, see if you can find me on the layout. And then we had a great trip in Baltimore, which you've all seen pictures of and heard about already, so I won't belay that. So for those of you that don't know, David Poteat, you probably have seen him in a couple of Zooms in the past. David is well-versed in the W&A, railroading in general. I think he'll give you a little bit of his own intro, and then he's going to be talking about his experience watching the Texas transform. So I'm going to pull up the show, and let's see. Yeah, what did we title this? Texas Restoration and Reality. So he'll give you a little sense of his links, and then how he observed the Texas and how it looked in '62, which I think a lot of us have seen, but he's got some interesting stories behind it around the post-war and how Wilbur Kurtz and this guy Franklin Garrett and Colonel Bogle came together to rescue this thing. And then he's going to show us, I'm going to show you some pictures that he sent me around the restoration and the controversies of the authenticity. So before I turn it over to David, here's some guidelines. David is like encyclopedic, but verbally so. So he will just keep going. And the only way you're going to get a question in is if you ask him, say, time out. David and I have already talked about this. He's cool. So he's just interested in you getting the knowledge that you want. So please take the license. Feel free to interrupt at any time. So with that, David, I'm going to just turn this over to you and take care of number 1 bullet there.
All right. Well, as you said, my name's Dave Poteat. I grew up in the Atlanta area. Was always fascinated by the Western Atlantic and anything to do Civil War railroads or Civil War in general. Was able to travel and see a lot of the locations during my life, and then had the good pleasure to work on the railroad in Atlanta. Worked for the New Georgia Railroad for a little over 5 years as an engineer and an engine mechanic. We pulled from downtown Atlanta at 0 milepost when we'd pull out the Georgia Railroad to Stone Mountain back. And then the other trips we'd take would be the 18-mile loop around Atlanta, the Emory Loop. So I traversed the tracks, and then we did make a run to Chattanooga with the 290 at one point up the Western Atlantic route, which is occupied right now by the CSX. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm very passionate about what I study, very passionate about history and it being correct. And I get very frustrated when people that are in a position to do the right thing find a way to do the wrong thing and pervert history, it really bugs me. I don't have patience for it. So that
Right.
tells you a little bit about me. So as I'm talking about what's going on, if you have questions or you see something you want to ask about, ask for sure. Definitely when we're on the pictures. If we try to go back to them, we'll probably never find them. So
Oh, I'll go back. No, that's fine. That's fine. He also was quite, uh, what's the word? Familiar with Colonel Bogle. They had a couple of interactions, and yeah, so he's got links to the sources, so to speak. So with that, I'm just going to start these, David, and you can speak to them as we go.
okay, a lot of you probably already recognize some of these pictures. The reason why we're starting with these is those are probably the closest renderings to what the Texas would have looked like when it first arrived at Western and Atlantic. Now, having said that, understand when the locomotives arrived there, they came without the pilots on them, without the headlights and without the stacks. Other than that, they were pretty well complete. They were transported typically by barge to Savannah and brought into Atlanta on the Georgia Road and then assembled at the Georgia Railroad Shop's final assembly, put on the road. I don't see a whole lot of indifference with either of these. I think the picture on the left with the green frame and the green trucks may have hinted to some of the colors that was found on the locomotive later in years and by some records. In fact, I think it may be a little closer to correct than the picture on the right that shows a black bottom under the engine. But other than that, that's pretty darn close to what that engine should have looked like at the time that it got to the shops. So next. That's the engine as it was arrived in Atlanta from Vinings when they agreed to release the locomotive. That says Vining Station. That's not actually Vining Station. The buildings in the background, if you look up the history on them, that's in Atlanta. But it was
That's my bad, guys. That's my bad.
Now you're good. You're good. And in fact, I think the original picture said Vinings on that as well, but that's where it came out of. But when it was on the NC and St. L, that's the way the locomotive would have appeared. It was coal fired at that time. They had a flat pilot on the front, and it was used mostly for switching services. I'm sure you all know that. And then it was moved over by sectioning rail at the last point to what do they call it, cyclorama in Atlanta when it was placed in the building. But that's the way she came out of Vinings there. You notice the headlight is missing and the proper pilot's missing, and it has a coal stack on it. So any questions?
I got a comment to make.
Mhm.
You said that the stack is a coal stack.
Yes.
But in reality, that the diamond stack was invented up in the far eastern states around 1830, 35, and was used for lumber. It was used for wood fire. That was originally what the stack was created for.
In that tall, slender design like that.
Yep.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, because what later happened is, and we've used them, both Tom and I have used them and a couple other guys, a tea kettle stack where it's the top is almost as big as a balloon, and the bottom comes down, and the straight part of the stack is only about 8-10 inches, and the rest is flaring up to a balloon style.
Right.
Right, like Radley Hunter.
No, it's not like that. It's just imagine this thing with the straight part short, and imagine the rest of it just blown up, but still the same shape.
Right.
Okay.
That's a picture of it before it was still in service there. It had, as you can see from the pilot beam, it had been accidentally run into an automobile, believed to be the first automobile train accident on record. That's what I've always heard. But I also want you to pay attention to the headlight, particularly that's on there. That would have been the correct headlight itself with an extremely large lens, but not necessarily the proper pedestal for the headlight as it ran during the days. But that's a pretty complete, pretty intact locomotive there with just some damages to it. Also take note now, and I'll tell you why I'm telling you this later. The front of the tender seems to be sagged in the front in most of the pictures. It actually was the sealed beam that went across underneath the truck had bowed severely over the years of service without being repaired. So
On that-
that's what.
On that center picture, is there water leaking out from the front of the underneath the number plate?
At one time, when you didn't get them sealed up really good and you were running, especially like a locomotive like that, it was designed to fire on wood. And then subsequent, when it was fired on coal, the extreme differences in the collection in the front of the smoke box would cause seepage around them. And especially if they let the engines completely cool and then heat and cool and heat, that was very normal.
Got it.
Hey, David,
That's the,
back in the,
Yes, sir.
the previous slide, are
Mhm.
those wood planks running along the side of the tracks? Was that something that you found when you were prevalent? I've never noticed that before. Looks like a wood walkway.
on the very first top left picture, I think you're
Yes,
referring to.
yes.
Apparently a lot of the railroads, and even if you notice the pictures of Atlanta downtown area during the war, there were wood planks running back and forth across the track areas. They didn't concrete a lot of things back then, but yeah, it would have been pretty normal to have wood walkways, wood planks along the sides of the rails to keep you out of the mud. If you're familiar with Georgia at all, you've heard of Georgia red clay. And if it rains and you step in it, by the end of the day, your foot's about 4 times larger from that stuff hanging on to you. So anywhere they could put down a wood
Whoops.
plank or something to walk on to keep you out of the mud, they would do so.
Thank you.
Oh,
No, we're good.
okay.
Getting
All
all
right.
ancients there, aren't you, Tom?
I know. I'm so excited. Thank you, Red. I appreciate that pull up, man. Thank you.
There we go. All right, as the engine progressed along, once it came back from Vinings and into Atlanta, and after the powers that be, Colonel Bogle and some of his friends, Franklin Garrett and the Wilbur Kurtz, people of that nature, managed to talk the railroad into the locomotive and a place to put it. They Wilbur Kurtz gave the design and the colorations the best that he could get from his father-in-law. As you well know, Kurtz was married to Fuller's daughter, so he had firsthand knowledge as to what the engine should have looked like and how it was painted. And even though that's a very good summarization, yep, we went away. There we are.
What the hell?
After the engine, can you see it?
Yes.
My computer's just taken over. Wait, I swear to God, I didn't do that.
Tom.
There you go. Once the locomotive was restored by an outfit there in town and then unveiled at the cyclorama, the pictures you're seeing are the later years of the cyclorama. Originally, the cyclorama, this locomotive was sitting in the basement. It is in the basement there, but they managed to take walls out and put supports up and open the room up larger so you could see the locomotive better. First time I ever saw it was like walking down into a dark dungeon. It was almost like a scary place to be. Couldn't tell a lot about it because the lighting was terrible. But when it was unveiled, Franklin Garrett saw it, and his disappointment was somewhat because even though they did have most of the coloration, what he thought was proper, they didn't have it striped off properly and things of that nature. But he was satisfied that the engine was saved and put back in some form of what it originally would look like.
No drawbar on that front cow catcher?
Can we get that picture back up?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it up now. I don't know what the hell's going on with this thing. It might be picking up my energy of enthusiasm and it's screwing up. Okay, let me try this again. All right.
Okay, on the picture on the right, you can see the link connected to the center beam, running down the center of the pilot.
Oh, okay, I see it. Okay.
And that link would just raise up and go into the pocket of the Lincoln pin coupler of the engine in front of it, or even a car in front of it. So it was still there. All of the pilots on the Western Atlantic, as well as the smokestack that you see, that's the diamond type
I'm
stack.
sorry.
Yep, you're good. Those were all fitted, made up in the Western and Atlantic shops. And because the Western and Atlantic shops and Georgia Railroad shops and A&WP all finalized right there in the Atlanta area, they shared a lot of design and tooling together. So most all of those locomotives shared that same looking pilot. None of the locomotives back in the day would have had the number board on the smoke box. It just had a flat door. And you'll also notice the headlight, I brought this up a while ago, is quite a bit smaller than the light that was on it when it was sitting in the yard. At some point, vandals had stolen the original headlight. They never found it, but that particular light was found in the Georgia Railroad warehouse, the freight depot in Atlanta, when they started cleaning the building out and they were doing restoration work. So because it was from there and they felt like it was the closest thing they were going to get, they put that one on there. It is not the original headlight, but it's a close proximity, a little smaller. More than likely, it was the light that was on the back of a tender at one point for a yard engine. But and then, as you can see, the tapered, the balloon type stack we were talking about, those were all made up and riveted in the shops. And they put their own type of spiral in the stack because you would think a smokestack's a smokestack, and it's not. The difference in woods that you burn in different locations, how fast they burn, how slow they burn, will dictate how your stack has to be designed. So if you want to slow that stack down, keep it from releasing from the smoke box and out of the flues, you put a tighter spiral in it. And they found that early on that worked well with their engines and their wood. So the headlight brackets were the later type that you'd see almost on a B&O engine or something of that nature. It would not have had that. It would have had flat strap bars holding it out with support bars coming from the front of the wood section down at an angle back to the boiler to hold the headlight still. Any questions there?
So is that a circle of HO track running around it?
That was a G scale.
G
that got
scale.
put in later years. We went over, Mr. Polk, the director of the building authority, asked several of us if we would go over to the museum and offer to do some work to raise the front of the tender. The guy that was a curator at the museum there at the cyclone was wanting to protect the engine. And y'all may remember about years ago, he caught a lot of flack for little changes he was trying to make to the museum, but he was truly trying to protect the locomotive. And we got over there and that stupid thing was running around and they did not even want to let us inside the rail to look at the engine, but the kid or the young man that was running the G scale had free access running around there. I guess he was more of a engine specialist running G scale than we were working on locomotives, but I told you humor. So again, very accurate there with the Texas on the back of the tender. Also notice it had the Lincoln pin pocket put back on the back of it. When it was on the NC in St. L, it had been converted over to a knuckle coupler. So that probably, based on the information that I've always been told, came out of that Georgia Railroad warehouse. Any of the extra parts they could find, they used on the engine from that warehouse. Here we go. This is getting into the reconstruction, rebuilding at Spencer Yards. Once the locomotive was moved from the cyclorama, it was taken to Spencer, North Carolina. Supposedly a professional crew was hired to do the reconstruction and the repairs that needed to be done before taking it to the Atlanta History Center. So that was the cab as it came off. The really interesting part to that is the cab itself. You notice parts of the upper cab are of the original woods, the hardwoods they used at that time. The repairs that were made along the way are the lighter color woods that were, where rot had caused and things of that nature. But the better part of the cab was the original cab, and the window pockets and things of that nature were correct. Also notice, Tom's trying to freak us out. You notice the tin hanging on the top right-hand corner. You notice that roofing that, there you go, where he's highlighting. That was almost like a thin leaded sheet, real pliable. You could wiggle it simply. And apparently that's what they used in the day to wrap the tops of the roofs with and keep the water from coming straight through the woods boards that basically made up the roof of the locomotive. We basically, the ones of us that looked at it and researched it, I think that's probably close to original, or was at least on there by 1870. It was older material. So, but thought that was very interesting. And then the orange inside the cab, Colonel Bogle had made the comment at one time that after the war years that they had started repainting the cabs and the areas inside the cab very bright or light. And they really didn't know why, other than, I guess, maybe just the engineers chose to do it. But so some of that original orange paint that he had referred to is still inside there.
Dave, was the original cab a curved roof? This is a peaked roof.
That's a peaked roof. That's what it
Yeah.
was when it originally on the railroad. Yeah.
Yep.
You know, all the Western and Atlantics, everything that I can find reference to them, they apparently had a standard build of cab size that they wanted for convenience for their engineer and firemen. And that seems to be pretty much the normal pattern for all of the Western and Atlantics.
A peaked roof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep,
Question,
very
Roger,
nice.
Roger, what's confounding you about that?
Well, I thought the General had a curved roof.
No,
Oh, it's peaked.
no, I mean, just look at a Mantua General, you'll see it there.
Yeah, that was rebuilt in 1880, though. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah,
you.
but not the dimensions of the cab. As a matter of fact, the cab roof is much harder to build, and that came at a much later date for all the railroads.
right. Dave, a question. And I forgot to put this image up. A lot of you guys have seen it. It's with DC and I and Brian and Chris in the cab. And it looks like there's a canvas that's rolled up to the roof in the back. Would that have been original to the 1860s, I guess, just to keep these guys warm or for whatever reason?
It would have been, now you say original, you mean would it be accurate to have it there for the climate? Yes, it absolutely would have been accurate to be there. Of course, they probably had to replace them every year to 2 years because I'm sure they got tethered in a hurry. But even on the locomotive 750 that we operated, that was a 1926 locomotive, it had a rolled up drape we could drop down to keep the heat in the cab.
Yeah, that's what I use. It's actually lead weight and it just helps. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay.
All right, this is where we really get to the nuts and bolts. I really enjoy this part of it, and I hope I can do it justice when I explain it to you. The picture on the left, I'll bring to your attention first. Of course, you can see the drawbar pocket, so you know you're looking at the back of the locomotive if you see the bottom of the firebox hanging down, and the rear driver on the locomotive. So the first thing I'll bring to your attention, and I don't know if Tom can enlarge that or if we need to work with it the way it is. Yes, sir, that whole area. There we go. That's good enough right there. If you notice on the driver wheel, everybody kind of pay attention to the spoke area right where he's putting it. You see the distance between the wheel and the flange there where that hand paw is at, how it hangs to the inside of the wheel. How they accommodated to go from 5-foot gauge to 4'9" gauge when they converted them over in 1886. When they standardized, that engine was still thought of well enough of and was in good enough operating condition that they chose to narrow the gauge and keep it in service rather than just scrapping the locomotive. So the little engine had a lot of popularity and they favored it and kept it up very well over the years. You can see on the wear mark on the tire area itself where the rail would actually hit it. And then to the right of it, you see where there's still paint on it where it doesn't rub off. That's where the original rail at 5-foot gauge would have been riding. That's where it would have sat. So the reason why that's important with some of the pictures coming up, you'll start understanding why I highlight that. We know that the 60-inch drivers were probably accurate or put on there within the first 5 years of its operation. But the tires would not have been replaced until somewhere around 1886. Picture to the right, a lot of original equipment showing here. Now, there's always been a lot of talk that the locomotive didn't have the original boiler. Okay, we agree with that. That's correct. But most of the bolt-on equipment, like where the arrow is at, the cap support section, the grab handle there, where the stanchion step would hang down from, all that's original off of that locomotive. The frame was original on that locomotive. The boiler that replaced the original boiler, at least around the firebox area, was of the same size. And we know that because that flat plate that's between the sandbox and the top of the boiler, that's the original flat plate from the original boiler bolted to the new boiler. It was done that way because it already fitted the cap. Everything fit normal. So when they disassembled it and pulled the boiler off the frame, built a new boiler, they made sure that they built something that the parts would still bolt back to. Any questions there?
So my assumption is that when they re-gauged it, they just put they took off the original tires and just put a thicker set of tires on?
That is correct. They took tires that were a wider, same diameter, but wider surface area. And that allowed for them to push the tractive area of the tire farther in on the locomotive without actually changing the axles and the spoke wheel sections of them. On the front wheels, they would drive the axle out of the wheel, machine the axle a little bit farther in, an inch and a half on each end of the axle, press the front wheels in. So you'll notice in some of the later pictures, it looks like the axle kind of sticks out farther than it should have actually stuck out. That's because it was the standard width for the 5-foot gauge. They just pressed it in farther. So that's exactly.
Yeah, I would assume for the tender, they just pushed in the axles on the tender.
Machine the axles in, put car wheels on them.
Yeah.
The regular freight car wheels on them. Mhm. Yeah, we'll see that also. The wheels that are under the tender are, I believe they had an 1888 date in Boston, and where they were poured. In other words, when they poured the wheels in the foundry, they put the dates down inside of them. And when they were done, I think it does say 1888 on the actual wheel of the tender. Now, this one's just more for fun than anything. This is so you can see where the engineer sat, how he operated the locomotive. And I just think it's a cool place to think we're sitting where they sat. Yeah, just to me, that's just too cool.
Amen.
So there's your Johnson bar, there's your throttle, there's everything that pretty much what he had for controls. And very simple. You had a steam gauge, you had blow down tubes. You can barely see. In fact, you can see them better on the right-hand picture. That's where the throttle comes out. On the right-hand picture, come up a little bit, up straight to your left, right there. See those 3 holes at an angle down in the back boiler right there? That's where your blowdowns would have been. It had 3 petcock type blowdowns. They didn't have sight glasses on them back then, like you think of the later engines having. So in order to know that the water was above the crown sheet, periodically they would reach over and blow down each one of those valves. You'd start at the top and work down to the bottom. If you open that bottom valve and there's no water blow out of it and only steam comes out, you're already in trouble.
Wow.
You got to, especially if you're going down a hill and you got nothing but steam, now you got a bad problem. So I'm sure you guys have seen pictures of boiler explosions. It ain't pretty. That's a dangerous situation. So any questions about that little area?
When did sight glasses become a thing?
You know, that's an excellent question. I think it was some of the locomotive companies that were like Alco and people that built later on had come up with the perfection of the sight glass with a thick enough glass that they could put them on. But the actual year they started doing that, I really don't know. I have seen a 1895 Southern Railroad steam 440. In fact, it's still at Tennessee Valley Railroad, and it did not have sight glasses when it was originally built. So it's kind of hard to say, and maybe it was based on railroads and the engine builders, but sometime shortly after.
I would guess John would have insight to that.
It was a slow adoption. They were still talking about it in the 1892 book I had, how it wasn't a universal thing. It started off as an auxiliary gadget.
That's right.
You were supposed to pay attention to your tricox before you did anything else.
Yep.
And it
Exactly.
probably wasn't until 1900 before the sight glasses were reliable enough that they could depend on them.
Yeah, that's very true. Even if a boiler was only at 125 pounds of pressure, 125 pounds of steam pressure, and y'all going to think, what in the heck is he talking about? He's lost his mind. The water, everything inside the boiler is at 125 pounds. At 200-pound boiler, everything's at 200 pounds. But as soon as steam hits atmosphere, it starts expanding rapidly. Think about a teapot on your oven or your eye on your stove, and as long as everything's down in there, it's all good. But as soon as you pop that little kettle a little bit, all of a sudden it expands quickly and wants to boil quickly. So that glass was out in the steam area part of the time. It was exposed to a lot more pressure as soon as atmosphere was exposed. Atmosphere is exposed every time you open the throttle. So it's just kind of one of them freaky things. You go, God, that's so great. I do know that when we rebuilt 290, it was a 200-pound boiler. It was a superheated boiler, meaning the flue tubes ran twice through the flues. And the expansion rate was 14,000 to 1. So 1 ounce of water would expand 14,000 times that size at atmosphere. Wow. And that's just astronomical. That's why you could take that locomotive and fill the tender up and run 260 miles before you put water in it again. You expanded it that much. So, all right. This one is that's very accurate and believed to be the original bell holder. The original bell itself was stolen at some time while it was in Vinings. That I believe that bell was probably found there again at either the Western Atlantic Shop warehouse up around Tunnel Hill, or it was collected from the Georgia Railroad freight depot there in Atlanta. But nevertheless, it was an older bell, definitely not a later diesel bell converted. But it's a little bit smaller and had a later stamping on it. But the bracketry, everything that holds it on is original style. And you notice it doesn't have a clapper in it, so you couldn't drive anybody crazy with that one. Kind of a quiet bell. But the other thing that you might notice there is at the front of I'm sure there you go, where he's pointing. At the front of the boiler and connecting to the smoke box, that piece of metal going right there was original to the smoke box. We know that the smoke box and the cylinders and the steam chest in the front were all over the original engine. The original boiler was likely at that end of the boiler, from the swell from the firebox down to the boiler, would have been a little bit larger in diameter based on that ring. It would have expanded out far enough to touch the outside of that ring. I don't really know why they chose to build it that way, if it's convenience or just an oversight, but they seem to make it fit, and the engine operated for many, many years that way. But that piece, those rivets from the smoke box to that piece there had never been altered from the time that engine was built. I thought that was pretty unique. Any questions there? Of course, you can see the handrail stanchions. That's what those are right there. That's the stanchions that bolted to the boiler with wedge type threaded bolts. It bolted right into the boiler sheet. And your stanchions would stand in those holes on the end of them upright, and then the handrail would go lengthwise of that. All right, we'll go to the next if you're ready. Tom, did you go to sleep on me?
It moved. I just moved it.
I was wondering where the snoring was coming from.
Whoops. You see that?
No?
Still see the back.
How about now?
Nope.
Nope.
Still looking
see
at the bell.
There's the bell. And
your
there's the next slide.
Don't say it.
What the hell?
Maybe skip that one and go to the next one, see if it feeds up.
How about that one?
Nope.
Nope.
Stuck on the bell.
Can you see the boiler and the Johnson bars?
Nope.
No,
On the bell.
It's
The
paused.
bell break.
Why the hell is it paused? Stop this.
Mhm.
What the hell? Oh, I know. Duh.
what?
Hey,
Oh, shit. Oops, excuse me. What the?
Go get him, Tom.
That video just got banned
Do it.
from YouTube.
Yeah. While he's doing, Tom, speak up again so we can see the picture of the B&O engine behind you.
Can you see it?
Yeah.
Notice the roof of the cab.
Peak roof.
Yep, peak roof. That's correct.
Can you see that?
yes.
Now you're back up. Yes. Mhm.
Oh, there we are.
There we go. All right, this one I just took a close up on so that everybody could see. That's actually got a stamping. If you can see real close there on that steel, it says 1886 on there. That's when most of the conversion was taking place. And the other stamping there, it's hard to make it out, but it was the NC and St. L logo or stamps. That's who did the conversion on it when they narrowed up the gauge on it. That's one of the parts they had to replace to do the narrowing of the gauge. It was just good to find some stampings that verified things. This is kind of a depressing picture, but that's the actual frame just above the journal box of one of the drivers. You can see all the cracks and busted marks in it, and even sections where they had pinned it to try to repair it and keep the engine in operation. In just a moment, you're going to see why that cracked in such ways that it seemed like it's an abnormal place for a locomotive to bust, and it is, but there's a reason why this engine did it. Pilot truck shows to be the original framework for the truck, the original spoke wheels. There again, the axles would have been machined in slightly and the wheels repressed in tighter to accommodate the 3-inch difference. And I'm saying 3-inch difference, and I hope you all understand that locomotive never made it down to 4 foot 8.5 inches. It made it to 4 foot 9 inches, but was adequate to run on the rail at that time. The switches were not as particular then as they are today.
Yeah.
Okay, next one.
So is it still so it's still technically gauged at 4'9"?
It is. Yeah, right now, the way it sets, it'll run, you could roll it down standard track today and it would gauge in just fine. You'd probably want to be extremely cautious about going through switches with it and make sure it doesn't ride the frogs, but it would still run down straight track, yes. Not that I would get on it and do it with that broken frame, but you could do it. Here's an original stamping, Western Atlantic stamping, 233. The 233 represents the locomotive build number from the builder when it was built in. So that we know that frame section and those end caps for that tender are the original parts for that engine. It doesn't say NC St. L, it says Western Atlantic. So that's the original stuff. And the board's laying there. Tom and I were talking about that earlier. You'll probably already know it, but if I tell you things you already know, just say, what's that idiot telling us stuff that we already know for? They planked the boards across the frame of the tender and put the tender body on top of it with a water tank. That kept them a cushion and kept it from rotting out and causing the two metals to rust together in the center. They even do that today on semi trucks and stuff. When they put body beds on them, they put wood between the frame and the bed. So still a standard practice today. Next one. All right, this is where we start getting nuts and bolts of things. That groove that you see there, that is the side of the frame just ahead of one of the driver wheels, right where he's highlighting. That's where on the frame where that wider tire, when the locomotive would go down the tracks and move through the turns, the tire was so wide based on the gauge that it would rub against the frame of the locomotive. And over time, it wore those grooves in several places on the locomotive itself. Kind of a scary thought about that is I would hate to think I was on an engine running down the tracks that the frame was being narrowed up as I'm going down through there on a steam engine. I don't want to do it on a diesel, much less a steam engine, but them guys were either brave or stupid. I'm not sure. Maybe both.
A little bit of both.
I got a little comment. Y'all seen the movie, the Disney movie, The Great Locomotive Chase.
Yes.
And
Some of
y'all
them.
all know that Fess Parker does not look anything like James Andrews.
Correct.
Fess Parker's neck's much, much shorter.
Yeah.
Told you I'm warped. I'm very. If you don't appreciate my humor, just tell me that I'm a knucklehead. I don't care. Pilot beam there that we're seeing, as we know, that had to be replaced later and sometime when the rebuild took place, because the original pilot beam that we saw in the earlier pictures, if you remember, was busted in the car accident that it had somewhere around 1919 or 1920. So that's not original wood. We do know that. But the actual smoke box front, the flattest part you see bolted around the front of the smoke box, that piece of metal itself was replaced, but the door looks to be original. So all they did is made a new box front for it, but the sides around the smoke box and then the steam chest and all are original. That's all original right there. Pretty interesting pieces. Even down to the fact that the original type of nuts on the ends of the cylinder caps, just that blows my mind that none of that stuff was updated. But pretty interesting stuff. There are also, you can see the difference in the axles sticking out on the front wheels where they're exposed, where they would have normally been flush. That was for the gauging. That's how they moved the wheels in. Okay, next.
So when did the hexagon nuts became the, I don't want to say standard, but it seems that I would have thought that they would have been square, not hexagon.
Well, hex nuts would have been a little bit farther back for anything that was machine steel type of things going together. That would have been pretty common even back in that day. I don't know when they kind of went completely away from the square head bolts. I had even seen in the past where some steel bridges were built in the early 1900s and had square head nuts on. So there again, I guess it's the area, the region, and how things were moving along and what was available at the time of any given build. But hex bolts seem to go back pretty far.
My assumption is that maybe they were using hex for specifically where it had to be more of a precision tightness or something.
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right.
Whereas, square, it's like, that was square was cheaper. So
exactly. And you can throw a monkey wrench on it and pull it tight enough. But it like you say, on the end of those cylinders where you're going to be torquing it down, I'm sure they had to have something a little better, more reliable than a square nut at that time. You're probably dead on when you think that way. These are some of the sand dome parts. As you can see, the base of the sand dome, the lids. I think that's part of the, I don't really understand. You have to remember this been almost 8-10 years ago when I saw this. I don't really remember why there was two lids there. One of them may have been a cap that went on top of the other, is all I can imagine. The one sitting down inside of the sand dome base, I think, sat on top of that other lid that you see there. But notice something there on that sand port for the sand to come out of the side of it. I should have shown you this earlier and I forgot to. On the engineer side of the locomotive for many, many years, that piece was missing. When it came out of bindings, when it went into cyclorama, and all the years that it sat in cyclorama, that port and the tube down to drop the sand on the rails in front of the wheels was not on there. It was on the fireman's side, but not on the engineer's side. They did go to the trouble to cast that piece and form a new tube and put it back together with both sand tubes on it correctly. So I'll give them credit for the things that they did right later, and why I don't give them credit for everything they did. So we'll kind of go from there. Some more of the parts that shows the original style, probably the original firebox door, the grate, and then I'm sorry, go ahead.
If he could find the plans.
Is somebody asking something?
Oh, I had a question. I was doing so restoration of some machinery from early 1900s, and they were not using American standard thread. It was something that, none of my thread stuff would recognize. Do you know when they started in manufacturing using standard, coarse thread, fine thread, and all that?
I don't. I really do need to study on some things like that. And as far back as I've had mechanical knowledge, I guess I've never really paid attention to that part. I do know that the threading on the locomotives, all locomotives that were steam, is not the same throughout locomotive. What I mean by that is, for example, that fire door right there where the heat plates on the inside of it, you see the 4 nuts holding it. Those would have been straight machine thread bolts that would have held that. But anything that's screwed directly into the boiler would have been tapered thread. And it was usually 24 thread to an inch. So I don't know where that number came up, why they used that. I don't know when they started using it. But for different applications, it could be straight thread, or if it was a pressured vessel, it would be a tapered thread, just like stay bolts were, so that the farther in you tightened it, the firmer it got inside the steel, expanding into the steel. Is that kind of answered, or?
Good enough for now. Yeah, we do.
Yeah, okay, but actual year, I don't know. But if you will, Tom, go back. There you go for 1 second. You notice the 4 steps there. You got the steps for the locomotive, drop steps down. The step in the center left, the larger one, you notice it's smoother and looks a little better. That was actually cast by them up there because one of the steps was missing when it got there. So they patterned somewhat off the step that they had, made a form out of the sand, and poured a step to go on the other side of the engine and dropped the bar down. I appreciated them doing that part of it instead of putting it back with part of the parts missing. So, and try to make it look as accurate as possible and not just do it out of sheet metal or something stupid like that. But anyway, I'll give them kudos for that. They did try to make that look good. All right, Tom.
Yeah, I noticed on the firebox story, it actually has, I guess, they got the square ones on the outside, which I'm assuming is holding something, not for, just holding it on there, but it has a hex cut on the center there.
Okay. Yeah, good question to bring up there. That's the left-hand side where he's pointing. That's the handle part. And then the other end of it actually kind of latches to the boiler. So when you raised up on that, it would release the other end so you could open the door. The 4 bolts that you see, the big bolt in the middle, of course, is for the pivot. The 4 bolts you see on the back of it, they would take another piece of smaller plate, steel, thicker, put it on the inside, and then add a third piece to the inside of that was larger, bore holes through them and mount it up in there. All that was for is to increase the width of that door so that the extreme exposure to the heat did not distort that door while they were traveling.
Wow.
So that's why. And I'm sure all those things were learned as they went along. They probably ran some engines that didn't perform too well. We've all heard the story. Was it the Best Friend to Charleston or one of them that they tied down one of the pop-off valves and wound up killing the crew early on in the early 1800s. So a lot of things they learned by killing people and saying that didn't work good. Let's do something different.
Right.
So
again, another.
So it looks like the first attempt to publish the standard screw threads was around the 1860s or 70s. They say 1864. So the British standard was in place in the 1840s, though.
Wow. But you're saying the American standard was 1960?
1860. 1864.
Okay. 1864. That's very interesting. That's cool.
Yeah,
that is cool. And there again is something I'd like to read on myself to see why they determined the number of threads that they did for the size of the bolt and things of that nature. Would be pretty interesting to know. But, all right. Any other questions?
There's a term we have in the modeling business called rivet counters. You are so far beyond that. You and like John Bopp and Jerry Dykstra, you guys make rivet counters look like Bush League.
Listen, from now on,
I love you guys.
I'm a thread counter.
Yeah, we got a new name. I love it. That's great. Thank you for that, David. Thread counters. You think you're rivet? Damn.
You're miles
Well, I
behind.
work-
Young.
I work in metal, and one of the rules that we always use is that you have to have 3 threads in whatever thickness of material you're going into, or it won't, or the whatever device you're attaching won't hold.
Wow.
So the thread is determined by the thickness of the material at the minimum.
Question, Andy. I have a question for you. So
Sure.
do you know if that awareness or practice was in place back then, that they had to have 3 red, what you just said?
It had to be. I mean, that's a basic mechanical thing that you would do.
Got it.
Otherwise,
Thank you.
it's not going to hold. It'll just rip through.
Right.
Sure. Makes perfect sense.
Anybody know what we're looking at here? Don't tell them, David. See who knows.
I would say the Stevenson valve gear.
There you go. You're spot on. Your eccentrics were on the axles. Of course, they were out of round to the axle deliberately. They fit center to those caps and those rods. And as the axles turned, it would rock those things back and forth. And that's what would rock the valves back in position of the valves. And of course, the valve's travel length was based on how far the Johnson bar was moved, forward or back. But that's exactly what that is. That's your Stevenson valve gear. And probably all original. And the only reason why I say that, the later locomotives with the same valve gearing would have had a much rounder cupping inside the valve gear, like the later early 1900, late 1800 Southerns and Central Georgia engines had kind of a rounding to them. Those are still square box type on the inside. So I believe those are probably the original. I did try to find stampings on them. There are stampings all over those pieces. In fact, I picked one of them right now. The piece laying, the half round laying with the bolt through it next to the cardboard box. If you look next to the bolt head,
Yeah.
come right there. See that stamping right there? I think that's stamp 3. And those things were stamped across them 1, 2, 3, 4 to kind of identify where they went in alignment on the engine. It was very important they went back to the same location.
So I have a question, as I'm the neophyte. These round things, these would go over the end of the axle?
No,
they go
There were sheaves on the axle.
Mm-hmm.
They were what?
Yep.
There were sheaves on the axle, and those would fit around a sheave that was on the axle.
Got it.
And
Thank you.
those sheaves were set eccentric to the axle in accordance with how the engine would be timed. And when the axle would rotate, then the sheaves being eccentric would make the movement in your valve rod or your cup.
Wow.
Very good explanation. Yes, very good. Think of taking 4 quarters and drilling oblong or rounded holes off center of each of the quarters, and then sticking a shaft to them and quartering them in force in 4 times. Those would be mounted to the axle, and then these pieces clasp over them and rock back and forth.
Got it.
Yep, pretty cool pieces there. I like seeing that. Tender frame.
What was the you said they were ordered 1 through 4. How did they go? Did they go from the engineer to the fireman, or fireman to the engineer?
I hate to say this, but without seeing them come off and seeing the order they took them off, I wouldn't really know that. That would be, and I'm sure the foreman at the shop would know every engine would be marked the same, but I've never found a record anywhere written that says that. And I was really kind of surprised to see those stamped, because someone that builds car engines, I stamp the connecting rods before I take them out of an engine, both the cap and the rod. And I have an order for them starting, in other words, a V8, the number 1 caps on the first cylinder are 1, both sides. And as you work back, you come up with 8. So with an engine, I always look at it this way, just like an automobile. The right side of an engine is the right side as you're setting in the engine, just like a car. The right front fender is the right of where you're sitting in the car. So I don't know if they started them left to right or right to the left or standing in front of the engine. I really don't know. I just know they had sent stuff to mark them where they would know. And maybe the eccentrics on the wheel axle set was stamped likewise, so they would
Oh,
know.
yeah. Yeah, they would have
So,
been.
It makes sense.
I did not get close enough to those. I do have pictures of them, but I don't think I made a close-up picture of any stampings on them. Tender frame. Most of the wood around the frame, the side big bolster woods seem to be original stuff. It's as amazing as that may sound, but it was very well kept. You can also see the plank boards they used to plank across the top of the tender and then set the steel body of the water tank wood hopper for it on top of it. The steel straps, things around the trucks, even the caps on the journal boxes are original type caps. We know that just because that was kind of a Cook and Rogers both had those caps made and sent to them. And I don't see anybody would have done that after those locomotive companies went out of business. So I kind of believe those have to be the originals. You can see the wheel sets where they cast the wheels. They have the later stampings and dates on them. We've got a closer picture here in just a moment where you can see the dates and numbers on them. So those would have been freight car wheels for later cars and probably freight car axles that were set to machined at the end to fit the brasses in the journal boxes. But most all of that equipment is original. You also notice I had mentioned before the front of the tender had sagged quite a bit, and we're looking at the back of it, but at the opposite end of it, you can tell now it's pretty darn squared level. They replaced that seal beam that goes across right where the pin, the center pin for that truck goes up. There's a seal beam that goes crossways with that tender. They replaced that with good heavy wood and straightened that frame out before they set it back down on the trucks. I was pretty pleased to see that.
Not spoked wheels?
I'm sorry.
Or the original wheels have been spoked?
No.
Yeah, I believe the original tender wheels for the Texas would have been spoked. And the only reason why I say that, most of that builders, if you see other locomotives that were built for other railroads by the same builder, it seemed like they had spoked wheels. And then there are some occasions, I have no idea why we see this, but there was occasions where they would have 3 spoke wheels and a solid wheel in one place on the tender. I never figured that deal out. I've never really researched it, but yeah, I believe they were spoked. I don't believe they would have been solid like that.
Well,
But then again, they used all the original hardware. You see the square head bolts and the flanges to put them together.
The solid
Up on the
wheels
side.
were replacements.
Mhm.
Spoke wheels weren't all that sturdy. So whenever you broke a wheel or lost a wheel set, you replaced it with a cheaper plate wheel. That's why some tenders and even locomotive pilot trucks have a mix of spoked wheels and plate wheels.
Makes total sense. That makes sense. And if you'll notice on those pictures too, on the sides of the wheel itself, the one to the front of that picture where it's actually upside down, you can actually see where it says car wheel right into the embossment where it was cast. Some of the others is not quite as legible, but I did figure out early on those wheels have been replaced along the way, and probably many times. Those wheels would have been replaced often, so that wouldn't have been abnormal. So, any questions there? Next picture.
Well, this is sort of like off the. It's about wheels, but not necessarily these types. From what I understand, there was a short time when they had paper wheels.
That's for passenger stock. I don't think they ever use those on tenders.
No.
Gotcha.
That was because they gave a smoother ride and were quieter. So that was pretty much limited to passenger cars.
I had never heard that myself. I just learned something myself. That's what I need to do. I'm a plethora of useless information. Next picture. Next picture there. There we go. I love this picture for several reasons. First thing you notice, you can see the newer axle. You can see the sizing where it was downsized to run in the bearing box, the journal box, and fit the brass properly. And you can also see that all the steel strapping underneath for the trucks is original type strapping and notched in the right places. But the one big glaring thing that I see is notice the bracket for the brake shoes where they hang behind the wheel. They're offset from the wheel. That's because that cross brace piece is there. In order to move that bracket over in alignment with the new gauging, they would have had to have re-drilled a hole through that frame and put a bolt through it. Well, as big as that bolt is in diameter and the amount that you're moving, you'd have had one bolt blending into the other. So rather than doing that, they left the brake brackets where they were and let the shoes ride halfway or partially on the wheels. But that, again, when I was told by experts up there that this engine was not a 5-foot gauge engine, and I pointed out things like that, that's when I became unpopular with them. They didn't like me so much. So, and I really didn't care. Any questions there?
Why would they think it wasn't?
You know, these guys that were working on that locomotive up there that were paid hands from a company that was getting paid ridiculous money to do what they did. They did a cosmetic restoration for what the cost that they charged, the price they got paid for it. They could have put a new boiler on it and had that engine under steam for the same money. And they kind of they did some things that were good, that they made some parts that were nice, and they cut some corners in some ways that I thought was pretty shoddy and pretty chintzy to do so. And so when they started trying to discredit the locomotive, two of the guys that were there working the day I was there, both of them saying, this isn't the Texas, this is just an older engine that they're mocking up as the Texas. I said, no, sir, that's the Texas. We know it's the Texas. And they were snotty and they wanted to tell me all the reasons why it wasn't. And I said, so explain to me why it was originally a 5-foot gauge engine. It wasn't, it was 4'8". I said, so that explains all the wear on the side of the frames, the wider tires on the drivers and the car wheels and things of that nature. At that point, I became unpopular. And my wife was there with me and she said, I think you need to quit bringing the points out to them. So she was realizing me.
Was the tender gauge to 4'9" or 4'9", or was that actually done to standard gauge?
Of course, the wheel sets always have to be the same depending on the rail width, but the original tender was built on a 5-foot gauge. Those trucks were on a 5-foot gauge. That's why the brake shoes are out as far as they are, or the holders for them. But then when they re-gauged, they widened the tires on the drivers, they machined the axles on the pilot wheels and moved them in. And then on the rear, on the tender, all they did is took car wheel sets and put them on there, machined the ends of the axles down to fit the smaller brasses.
Mm-hmm.
So that those wheels right there, I would probably, I bet if you threw a tape measure on them, those wheels were probably 4 foot, but the drivers, they couldn't get them narrower than 4'9". And I know a 1/2 inch don't sound like much, but after seeing the wear on the frame in the places we did, can you imagine another 1/4 inch on each side of that locomotive beating on that frame? It's pretty pathetic. In fact, I think we've missed a picture. We'll have to see if we can pull it up. There's some pictures that I provided that shows where the spring brackets actually rub the side of the boiler from being pushed in.
Yeah, from my understanding, when the great gauge change, from my understanding, they didn't go to standard gauge. They wound up going to the 4'9". Now that seeing this, maybe the reason why they did that is so they wouldn't have to, well, rebuild all the locomotives.
Exactly. Yeah. They compressed them as tight as they could compress them, and probably knew when they moved those drivers like they did that they were going to have a problem. But you also recognize that in those days, switch points weren't as tight, and as you didn't have power switches, everything was hand thrown. So tolerances for a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch on each side would not have been as particular in the 1800s as it would be today. Today, I wouldn't take that engine and try to run down a modern track with these new switches. It would jump every frog you came to and probably pick the points of the switch points.
In fact, back then in the North, they had cars that were called compromise cars that had wide tread wheels on them. So the flanges would be for standard gauge, but they'd run on, the slightly wider, I think 4'9", 4'10" track.
Right, the Ohio gauge.
Yeah.
Ah, it was a perfect example. Yeah. And then there was one of the railroads in America that was on a 6-foot gauge. And I remember reading it one time, but I don't remember who it was.
Erie.
Erie, that's right. 6
Yes,
foot
Erie.
gauge. Any questions about that tender shot? Next one.
Where do I get mine?
I know I'd love to have taken it home, but they wouldn't let me. We had talked about in one of the meetings before about the injectors or how they would inject water or pump water into the boiler. These locomotives did not have steam-driven injectors like we think of the lifting injectors, like you think of later steam engine. In order to get water pumped into the boiler, the engine had to be moving forward and back. Those eccentric rods had to be moving as well to get the water to pump and get the pressure. So if the locomotive's sitting still too long at the station, long enough that the water level can go down in the boiler, they would literally uncouple the engine and run it down the track and back to pump water in the boiler. This was part of that equipment that was done. So you can see behind the valve gear where the pump rod was connected to that. You see a drop rod hanging down from an overpin, and that rod would run back and forth and run a piston inside that tube to compress that water up in that boiler. The other at the top of there is just a check valve, so that once water went in and you shut the valving off at the cab, the water couldn't turn around, come right back out of the boiler and right back down the tubes. Pretty interesting stuff that they built. No, most all of that was out of cast brass and copper. The tubes were copper. And I'm sure when those engines were new and they really kept them shined up, those were beautiful pieces to see. So, all right, next one. Seat box. Don't know if it's original or not. It was interesting that somebody had carved their initials in it. It fit the proper cab, but I guess it could have been original. It had a lot of coats of paint on it. For example, you can see a piece in the background that still had some of the orange paint on it that came from underneath the engine. But that box looked like it had about 10 layers of paint on it. But somebody along the way had put their initials on it, and it obviously wasn't Fuller or anybody operating the train in 1860. But I thought that was pretty unique. If they thought enough of the engine, they put their initials on it. Next one. Do y'all know what that is? That's supposed to be the Texas. I hope you can understand why I'm aggravated. That's what the engine looked like in 1926 when the NC and St. L finished using it without the name Texas on it. It did not have the number 12 on it. It had the number 212 on it. It had that coal burning stack. It did not have that pilot. No Western and Atlantic engine had a wood front pilot like that. That's more of a B&O thing. Mm-hmm. And why paint it black? Yeah. They never paint their engines black. Why are the drivers black? Maybe it sounds nitpicking, but now I'll explain why I feel the way I do. If you take a locomotive from a museum that's on static display and you move it to what's considered one of the greatest museums in all of Georgia, the Atlanta History Center, and turn it over to them to do a recondition, a cosmetic restoration, why would the curator at that museum decide to make it look like something from 1926? The reason why I say that, do any of you guys really care what that engine did in 1926?
No.
The only reason why the engine was saved is what it did in 1862. So had it not been in the Great Locomotive Chase, the engine would have probably been scrapped 10 years later, like all the rest of them of its time. But because of what it was, as well as the general, it was kept. And why a curator at a museum of authority to maintain history would pervert that engine in any such way as that, I have no idea. But he and I don't talk anymore. And it's not that I won't talk to him, he won't talk to me.
He's just drinking too much.
I can't understand. I cannot understand why.
I
any-
think it's a political, I think he's beholden to somebody, or it's clearly
It is.
that whoever had the cash behind this had some influence in what this was gonna look like, right?
Or they ran out of money and they couldn't afford a more expensive paint job.
to paint it the right way. And for the
Right.
money they spent doing this, they could have painted it 6 times over correctly.
I got an observation and a question for you, Dave.
Mhm.
Why is the boiler sheathing painted this dark a gray or almost black, when in the day it was really more on the silver side?
The whole engine's painted black.
Okay.
Well,
The
no,
act-
I'm
the
not
jack-
asking about that because I know about that, but you know, Russian iron is never black and they usually never painted it like that.
Russian iron, depending on who did it, and you all know this without me telling you this, when they would heat the metal, when they form their sheets for the jacket and get ready to put it on, they would heat the metal and they would oil it for resistance to weather and bake it and then wipe it with the different materials and then rub it down with the varnishes. It could vary in the shade from engine to engine based on the composition of the steel, how dirty the oil was, how clean the oil was. A lot of
Right.
things could vary it. So Russian iron could vary in color.
Right.
What we see pictures of it being in silver. I love the pictures of it in silver. In fact, I've got a couple of my engines that I've done with the silver boiler because they show up so good. But it probably would have not been actual silver because that would have been raw steel, and raw steel would have rusted quickly.
Right.
So if they did anything right with this engine, they actually did the boiler jacket correct. They even put brass straps on it.
Wait a minute, that dark a color on the boiler?
Yeah, and a lot of the color on it, if you'll notice the two pictures side by side, the picture on the right looks much lighter than the picture on the left. The shading of it will change as the cloud cover anything inside and outside. As
No,
it's sitting under the
I know
building.
that. I know that. I understand all that, but that's 1862, that period, that it's that dark?
Sure.
That's
depending on the oil
confusing to
and the
me.
steel.
Huh?
Yeah, depending on the oils that they used at the time, if they used reused oil, oil out of boxes, things of that nature, it can change the shade of the color for sure based on how long they needed it.
Okay, but any of the other engines, the Americans that we see of this period, the boilers were always lighter. They were never this dark.
Well, we don't know. And the reason why I say that.
Well, I
all-
know what you're saying, but
There are some examples that I have seen of Russian iron from locomotives that managed to survive. And there is quite a range on those, and that gray matches at least one of them.
Mhm.
I like, John, what do you say?
Well, Russian iron is normally darker than everybody thinks it is because it photographed light in black and white photography. The best reproductions of Russia iron that I know and the samples of actual Russia iron that I know about are all at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. And their engines have been restored to that kind of a standard, and they all come out more or less dark like the photographs here show.
Wow.
okay.
Those are the
Yeah.
pictures I'm talking about, John, were the ones at the Nevada Railroad Museum. And it was kind of surprising because intuitively, I always wanted to use a lighter blue color.
Yeah, we all kind of did before, you know. I can't emphasize enough how information is getting around a lot faster these days than it used to.
The internet's
Yeah, Russian iron is part of that. We used to think it was lighter and bluer, but no, it's really a dark gray. And the lightness and the blueness that we see is mostly caused by outdoor photography.
Right. Sunlight.
Mhm.
Fascinating.
in a lot of ways,
Reflecting
like in a lot of ways, it's like the bluing of a rifle barrel. When you're making a rifle barrel, you could do 5 different barrels and use the same material, and all 5 of them come out a little different shade on the original bluing.
Yeah.
We don't see that much anymore. Everything's black, it seems like, but
Well,
everything-
isn't the picture on the left, is that also in the shade? So that might be a reason why it's darker.
yeah, it is shaded. And the day that they pulled it out at Spencer, that's actually at Spencer. When they pulled it outside of the engine shop, the cloud cover going back and forth all day long was just ridiculous. You'd think you'd be set up to get a good shot and get everything ready. Next thing you know, the cloud come over and everything would be changed. So, in fact, I thought all day long it was going to rain, but it never did.
David, a question for you. When we were talking earlier, as we were putting this together, you were telling me about what it cost for them to have that dome, the smokestack recast. And is it of your opinion that the money that they spent on this could have been spent to make it look more authentic, or would that have really cost more? And they had to dummy it down. They thought, well, the second most recognizable aspect of this was at this period, and it was a financial thing. Do you think?
I think that's an excellent question. I wondered, as the construction was going along, how money was being spent and where it was being spent. Some of the places they cut corners absolutely blew my mind. Why would you have a guy come out there and set up sandblast equipment and sandblast half the engine? Things like that I question. That stack, and you can't hardly tell it from the picture, but that stack is actually riveted and formed together and cast pieces that fit remarkable. And whoever made it, they charged them an arm and a leg to do that. And my argument was, why would you spend money replacing the stack when you had the stack that was on it from the museum before? There was no need to spend a penny on that stack.
Did you get an answer?
Same pilot, same as the pilot. Why would you build a wooden?
Yeah, it's wrong.
It's definitely wrong. It's just dead wrong to do it that way. And there's several things in that picture that when I look at it, I just want to scream, because no Western and Atlantic engine. I don't recall ever seeing a picture of an A&WP engine in those days, or a Georgia Railroad engine that had a pilot like that. That's more of a B&O thing. That's more of a Northern type thing. They primarily always had a steel pilot and mostly strap iron pilots on there.
Right. Hey, David, did you say you actually asked that question to somebody?
Yeah,
What
I
was
asked
their
curator
answer?
of the museum, and I
What was
wanted to
their
know.
answer?
He wanted to be argumentative with me that what they wanted to represent was the engine as its full life, not just one event of its life. I said, I understand what your idea is. The problem with that idea is it did not matter what that engine did in 1924. It didn't matter what it did in 1913. What did matter is what it did in the Western and Atlantic when it was in the great locomotive chase as the Texas. That was the only history that mattered about that engine. That didn't sit well with him. I want to hear that. And I still feel like today he's an idiot and he thinks I'm an idiot. So we'll agree to disagree and just agree that I won't bother to call him anymore, since he won't take my call anyway. But
before we continue, go ahead.
That answer that the curator gave sounds to me a little bit like an answer that was made up after the fact, when they realized that what they have is a 1926 looking version that they shouldn't have gotten. I mean, did he even know what he was doing at the time to come up with something that looks like this?
Yeah, unfortunately he did. All right, I'm okay. Why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Remember, this is being recorded. No names.
Yeah. And I'm not going to call anybody's name because, but personal friends of mine that work with me at the New Georgia Railroad are very involved today at the Spencer Museum. I think the world of two of them are a husband and wife, and I think the world of them, they're wonderful people. And he's the one that got me the ability to get in there where nobody else could get and make these pictures. Unfortunately, he had no idea it was going to blow up in his face and cause him a lot of problems. And I never intended that to happen. And I hate that happened. But I think the anger and the fury of seeing what they were doing. Now, when you say that about did it accidentally happen or did it get too far? It had been drawn up this way on papers and images and sketches before the engine ever had a sandblaster put to it. They knew they were going to do this to it before they ever started stripping it down.
Yeah.
That angered me by itself, and they were not open to talk to anybody about it. Now, the next thing I'm going to say, and I hope and pray that nobody on here or that ever hears this will take exception or think by any way that I'm being racist. I don't want it to sound that way. I think they were afraid of, because the engine going in Atlanta with the population, that if it represented the war with all the monuments that were being taken down at the same time, that it might cause a fury.
Yeah, I got
That's
that.
all I could speculate.
Right. That's a good speculation.
Yeah.
And I would hate the engine is setting in a building that has a glass wall all the way down the fireman's side of it. And it would absolutely disgust me and kill me for somebody to bust those windows and do something to that locomotive.
Right.
But I absolutely love that piece dearly. I was 7 years old the first time I laid my eyes on it, and I still think it's beautiful. And to be honest with you, look at the pictures, it's beautiful. That is beautiful, but it is nothing like it was during the Civil War. So,
Okay, here we go.
Well,
there we are.
Yeah,
there we go. Wrong. But
one question before we leave that, on the left-hand picture between the that I don't want to call it piston and whatever's holding the front, is that a chain? See, zipping
here?
Yeah, no, go up more forward, but between the pilot, yeah, right there. A little bit up.
Right at the bottom.
Those are the
Yeah, there. What's that?
That's the cylinder.
It just,
Yeah, it's the bolt line.
Just
in-
the
in the
light
cylinder.
reflection.
it's just okay.
It's
It's
a reflection. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and the
Ah,
blow down valves on the bottom of the cylinders to get the moisture out when you start moving. That's what that other piece is.
Right.
what's this
cylinder
piece below the cylinder?
Yep. While you've got that blown up, let's talk about something else.
Well,
Quick
I got a
question. Quick question.
Mhm.
What is this piece under the cylinder?
cylinder
That's your
cock,
blow.
Snifter valves.
Thank
No,
you. That's
cylinder.
right. Yes,
not
thank
snifter
you.
valves, cylinder cocks. Snifter
Yeah,
valves
yeah.
are in the smoke box, and that's to keep the cinders from going back into the cylinders when you
That's
turn the steam off. But what
Mhm.
are below the cylinders are cylinder cocks, which is to blow the water out of the cylinders when
Right.
you start up.
Exactly. Yeah. When
So
you
water
set
actually
steel-
comes out of this?
Yes.
when you set steel under steam, condensation builds up in the cylinders on both sides of the piston. So in order to keep water will not compress. And
Exactly.
if you get enough water in there and enough steam pressure behind it and move it, you can knock the head off of it. You can blow the piston apart.
Right.
So in order to keep that happening, you open those valves and slowly start opening the throttle and moving the engine, and it blows the water out from the bottom before it compresses or
And that-
tries to compress.
Is
That
there a
bar
control in the
across-
cab? You would control
Yes.
that, or just
That's what the bar
Yes.
across the bottom is for. It's linkage. And there's a lever in the cab that you use to actuate it.
okay?
Right. And in later years, it was all done with steam. You had valves that you could turn and open them. So yes, you're correct. That's all linkage for that.
Wow.
You notice another thing, that the locomotive number, they put 12 on locomotive.
Well, it's
At no
interesting
time
that
in the
they
Texas
labeled it
history was
for
it-
Western Atlantic when they've got a 1926 livery on it, and it wouldn't have been lettered for Western Atlantic in 1926.
Bingo.
Yeah.
It would have, if it had any, it would have been NC and St. L. It would not have said Texas on the cab. It
Right.
would not have been a number plate on the front of it like that says Western and Atlantic, Atlanta, Georgia. And the number 12, ironically, was the Cincinnati.
Hmm.
See, you biased? Anybody see anything going on there? The guy that's a curator to museums from Ohio. See anything? I saw that and I absolutely thought I was gonna have a coronary.
Which?
You put the number 12, the number of the Cincinnati on the Texas. To me, it's a slap in the face. It's just a slap in the face.
Well,
if you're gonna put this number, it should have been 49.
Oh, right.
The locomotives, when they started receiving numbers and quit getting names on them, the locomotives that existed on the Western and Atlantic were numbered based on their age in the inventory. The oldest one
Right.
got number 1 and all the way down the line. The Texas was the 49th locomotive built for the railroad. So it got the number 49, even though there was probably only 20 locomotives ahead of it. Instead of numbering it 20, they numbered it based on when it came into the railroad. Just like the General being 3 was of the modern engines coming in, it was the third locomotive of that engineering group.
Let me ask you. So what would be your take on why they numbered it 12?
Number 12 on the roster was the Cincinnati. The Cincinnati, prior to being the Cincinnati, was the I have to go back and look. Oh crap! What was that engine?
Was it related to the W&A?
Oh yeah, it was like the Gazelle or one of the others. It was one of the early,
okay.
not the Senator or any, but it was Gazelle.
Czar.
So that would have been an earlier number, but the Cincinnati, when it got changed to the Cincinnati, shortly thereafter, it got the number 12. So number 12 was always associated with the Cincinnati, and the curator, being from Ohio, decided he liked the Cincinnati number on it. Not that it had anything to do historically with that engine. He just liked it.
Wow. Well, you get the, if you're paying for the job, it's like,
I guess
it's your railroad.
Yeah, and here's the sad part. He's not paying for it. He spent somebody else's money.
Okay.
Raised funds to put this thing back like it should be.
Well, he has
And the whole thing just really bugs me, but I need to hush. But I'm glad that it's restored. I'm glad that it's in a wonderful place to be. And not only did this get moved at the time, I'm sure you all are familiar with the cyclorama painting that was painted and was at the museum, or the cyclorama in Grant Park. The painting as well was moved. They built a building for the painting to go in it. And they also put back 12 linear feet from the ceiling to the floor of the painting that had not gone in when it was put in the cyclorama in Grant Park.
Right.
So that was great. They restored the painting. They put the engine in, kept the artifacts together. And now in the room that locomotive is in, the actual original 0 milepost marker is mounted on the wall there. And there's a replacement marker where the original marker was at downtown. And that's fine. I'm glad about that. But I get a crawl with that. And then if you ever, I won't say, I'll just let you all decide for yourself. If you get a chance to go see the cyclorama, or you go online and look at pictures of it, just kind of pay attention to the soldiers and see if it looks like it would be accurate.
Right. Hey, David, somebody sent me a text.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a point of view about that painting that Wilbur did. So let's see, let me go here. It's almost, that roof looks arched, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it would be hard pressed to say that it's arched or hexed or whatever with that picture. You can also notice that he drew that or painted that with the running boards being the original roll down on them like they were, and it doesn't have those anymore.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I don't know. There's quite a few things on the painting. If you look at that, there's quite a few things that aesthetically don't line up properly. But that's, I don't think you can draw a picture like that. I don't care if you're Wilbur Kurtz or who you are, and make it absolutely perfect. Perfect example of what I'm talking about. Look at the bar on the front, the coupling bar. It looks arched in there, and that would have been a straight bar.
I gotcha. So, but it's not plausible that a cab roof would be arched, correct? Back
There
then.
would be, not on the Western Atlantic. It wouldn't have been rounded on the Western Atlantic. Nor the
Thank you,
Georgia.
brother. Thank you.
Mhm.
You can
Yeah,
definitely
the one
move the ladder a little
behind you-
bigger.
I'm sorry.
I said
Could you
def-
move a couple slides forward to the 1926 pictures just to, yeah,
Okay, hold up right there. Perfect picture. See the number on it? It's not 12,
yep.
212. That's what it was on the NC and St. L. I'd have been
Fascinating.
fine. I'd have been fine with that. But
You know,
Mhm.
David told a story about, and I know we got to go or stick around. I mean, I'm in for a little while here, about Wilbur Kurt's relationship to all the body parts of the locomotives in some warehouse. Just tell a quick story about what you know about Kurtz and his involvement with saving this equipment.
Wilbur Kurtz was a go-getter. He was somebody, he loved the railroad. He loved the history of it. He wanted to preserve as much as he could, and he had the contacts. He'd been around everybody. He could walk into any shop at any time and they'd welcome him. They all knew who he was. So when he started trying to put everything together for this and getting tips of where things may be, he was the one that discovered that the freight depot, the Georgia Freight Depot across the tracks from Zero Mile Post still had a lot of old engine equipment in it. And he also found out that the warehouse up at Tunnel Hill, which is still standing today, by the way, Granite warehouse up there, they had a lot of equipment that had been taken off of engines and even passenger cars and stored away that was no more useful for diesels or
Wow.
So he started getting around going and finding parts and collecting things up. And I think I had heard or read, I think I heard one of them saying that he went and picked up the stack in the back of a great big Buick or something and put it in the trunk, and it was sticking out of the back and roped into the back of the car as he brought it back to where he needed it. But he tried to bring the pilot back, and the pilot was too big, and he managed to have an association with a guy that had a truck. And apparently it must have been a truck with a flat bed on the back, not like a pickup truck today. And he went up there for him and picked up the pilot, and it took several of them to get it loaded because it was extremely heavy, and brought it back. So as they started gathering the parts up and putting everything together, he was the guy getting out and going and doing the legwork, finding them, and in some cases bringing them back.
Wow.
And on kind of a novelty thing, the number 3 plate on the General and the number 49 plate that was on the Texas, that was actually a Wilbur Kurtz idea. The railroad had done work on them over the years. The Western Atlantic never had a number plate on the front of them when they did that. When they ran them, they were named, not numbered. And he thought it would be kind of an attractive addition to it. So having said that, even the guy that wanted to keep it maintained, knew it was the Texas, knew the General was the General, kept those locomotives from going to scrap yards. He even took a few liberties himself to do things that weren't 100% correct.
Right. Right.
But
Wow.
God love
What a-
him for
I was gonna say, what a journey this thing's been on. It's just, yeah, stimulating.
If it could talk.
Cool.
One thing I've noticed is, I don't know if it's an optical illusion or it seems that the cylinders were not perfectly horizontal.
They're not. The Texas are canted cylinders. The General are absolutely horizontal to the rail. The Texas are canted down. Different locomotive builders at that time had different theories. And one of the things I have also been able to discover is some of them were even designed to be able to reposition them slightly for the effect of the railroad. You got to understand that the early physics of what they were doing, they didn't know as much then as they do now with computers and everything else. But it was thought that if you cant the cylinders for a freight locomotive, you got a better torque pull off the engine to cant the cylinders. Colonel Bogle had made the comment to Ken and I one time that he believed that's the reason why the Texas was able to run maybe quicker reverse than it was forward, because it took away that disadvantage of the torque running it backwards. Wow. And he gave it a slight advantage over speed. Also, of course, we well know that the general had a lot of things going against it. Running out of wood's a major problem. Major rainy day when it was all taking place, not having sand to put down anymore. The sand had gotten contaminated in the sand dome and wouldn't come down on the track. So they were getting a lot of slippage. And nothing that they were trying to do along the way seemed to work out. They didn't get the bridges burned down. They didn't get enough rail pulled up. So the engines were able to catch them. And let's not forget too, the General's not the only locomotive that chased the Texas is not the only locomotive chased the General.
Correct.
Three.
Right. Yeah.
And then the locomotive, the Yona that they just had in the movie, The Great Locomotive Chase, that was a local engine that actually still existed over at a rock quarry there in Rome, Georgia. And that's what was used for the movie. But the actual Yona was quite a bit bigger than that. It wasn't as big as the Texas, and it did have an upright type firebox in it, but it was a larger 440, not a little small 240.
You're speaking to the choir, no question about that. Yeah, that's good stuff.
These guys know way more about that.
So gentlemen, any other questions for David?
I got a question. And who is the builder of the Texas?
Texas is a Danforth Cook. And,
okay.
General was Rogers.
Yeah, right. Because
Rogers.
General had the fluted dome, sand
Right.
dome. So that's how we know that.
Actually, the General did not have a fluted dome when it was built.
No.
The General did not have a fluted dome. I know y'all are going to hate to hear that.
Well,
The
that's okay.
General-
Details I don't have to put on. That's okay.
It had
It
one- one during the Civil War.
John?
Yeah, the fluted domes didn't come into use until 5 years after the General was built. It did not have fluted domes at all.
It had a round sand dome with almost flat round lid on it with a knob sticking up where you could pick it up. And it also had two steam domes. The throttle dome was in the back and the whistle dome was in the front. And that was supposed to be
Question. The sand domes that come with the General, are those accurate?
Yeah, for later.
Yes, but not
when the General got rebuilt, it got somewhere or another, they found a spare Rogers sand dome.
Bingo.
That's
When you say
I got this is strictly selfish on my part because I'm building these little dogs. Are you saying that those domes that are on the General now are inaccurate for the period that I'm doing?
Unfortunately, yes. Hey, I got some on mine too.
I was really enjoying this presentation till now. So
It's a really
I'm
big
kind of
rivet,
done
Tom.
getting into the number of whatever they are, threads on the screw. I'm just.
If it makes you feel any better, nobody is casting in brass the proper sand dome, so we take the liberty to use the fluted too. I've got them on mine as well.
Good. Only us know. It's not confidential. Well, until it goes out to the internet.
We're not.
Well, what about the steam or steam dome?
Steam domes would have been they had a sheet metal top, of course, to keep the heat into them, but they're almost flat across the top of the actual structure of them because it's a plate that has the threaded tubes going in for your pop-off valves and your throttle lift.
So then the dome that comes on the General is not correct.
Correct.
Okay.
But it looks like the General, when it was restored by the L&N and carried all over the country in 1960s. So, and there again, we can go back and say, the General's not correct. The General on the Western and Atlantic was never red and black, ever.
Right.
That never happened until the L&N took over the NC in St. L. And then they decided to take the tour with that locomotive and painted it that way. That's when they came to play. And the really sad note to that is the baggage, the combine car that was behind the General on its trip is sitting in a museum rotting to the ground today. It's been left out in the weather exposed. And I would have thought somebody had forethought to keep that up.
You're talking about the real long one, right?
Yeah, it was one that was used during the 1962 centennial, and
Right, but
I mean, they went over.
that thing's ugly.
It was yellow.
One of the
Yeah.
B&O surviving cars is sitting in a container in toothpicks because they can't restore it. When from
Which
the collapse of the roundhouse, they had 3 and now they have 2 put together, and the other one is toothpicks. But they preserved it.
Right.
There you go. They still have it.
Yeah, but it's
If you
gonna
need-
take a lot of wood filler to put it back together again.
Wow, unreal. Yeah, you're talking about the B&O collapse with the snow collapse.
Correct. That was yes, because I was up there when that happened. I did the 2012 trip to be the 2012 trip to Baltimore, and we were sponsored by the B&O Museum.
Wow. How about that?
Because the Civil War comes by rail, and one of the curators was a member of our group, so we got sponsored. Got lots of real fun backroom tours and got to climb on stuff.
Joel, remind me, who was the member that was the curator?
I'll pull the name up. You're asking a man that can't remember his own name now. Remember
we all got
from 10 years ago.
Was it John Vrana?
No, not
No.
John there, but it wasn't John. It wasn't. But John's more DC,
Okay.
not B&O.
Oh, right.
Right. But that was but you know, that was when they were recovering, and lots.
Right.
The problem you get when you get something gets to a certain age and you got X amount of dollars. I work out of the National Gallery of Art, so I work in a museum. I deal with curators, and there's always a debate, and I totally get it. What do you retain something as?
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Uh,
Sure.
And what's the Greek myth, the boat? And you replace every plank in it. Is it still the original boat?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's called.
Mhm.
Was it Theseus?
Yes, the Theus. And it's he built, the boat. It's, George Washington's axe. The head's been replaced 3 times and the handle's been replaced 6. I understand where the curator's coming from. Another curator will come along and have a different philosophy.
I know, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's around for another 20 years. There'll be another interpreter.
Exactly. Never fails. Never fails.
Yeah. So all you do is start working on getting a different curator there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we were at the museum at B&O in 2002, just after the September 11th deal. And I was amazingly impressed with what they'd been able to do. And then to read the story about the original owner of the B&O, how he had the forethought. We're early on, but we need to start a museum right now and keep some old stuff and never get rid of it. And other railroads, they couldn't scrap it quick enough.
Yep.
Right.
So you've got lots of missing things from that period. And the locomotives that have come forward from the 1860s, it's always going to be a debate what they really look like. There's one out in El Paso, University of Texas, as the oldest only Civil War loco. No, there's another one. There's one up here in the Galveston Museum. To the Civil War, but they were all preserved after long operating lives.
Right. Similar to the Texas, it operated a long time.
Right.
Yes.
When you punch the
It actually looks like when the Texas was a lumbering engine. Yeah. They ran wood and carried flat cars with the wood on it.
Right.
Correct. Exactly. And the locomotive that I worked on in Atlanta when we rebuilt the A&WP 290, it had set it apart for 50 years when it was drug out from the Southeastern Rail Museum. and brought up to the shop to build. We started working on that engine, tearing it down and doing everything we could do. I mean, it went down to a barrel boiler, all new flues, everything. But we discovered while we were under it working, the steam chest in the front, one half of the steam chest was off with the 190, not the 290. The 290 was wrecked at one time in its life, running just a line of boxcars. And the employees liked the engine and enjoyed the operation of the engine. So they scavenged parts off of other locomotives that were being scrapped and put that engine back together. At one time, the general, and this came straight from a Pegram Railroad man that worked there for 54 years. He said that not the general, the 290 was carried on the backside of Inman Yards in Atlanta and drug out on a track that was hidden, shielded by trees where nobody'd know where it was at, and hid from the president of the railroad so it didn't be scrapped. He thought it was long gone. It was set out there in the woods all the time. So, pretty neat. But yeah, that one there again, like you said, when does it not become the engine anymore? Well, that one had some parts replaced, but it was still the 290.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, I've enjoyed this immensely. David, thank you so much. You know, from a modeler's point of view, and don't take this personally, but I probably won't have you do another presentation on anything that's related to my period. Hey, you guys, you know, have him, you know, he's available. Call him up, do your own Zoom. That's cool with me. Just record it. I loved it, David. Thank you so much. And gentlemen, always a pleasure to see you all. Please stay healthy. I'm looking forward to the guys coming up for an op session on the 12th and 13th. We're going to have a good old time. So happy trails till 2 weeks from now.
Thank you for having
me. Rail.
See you, everybody.
Been great.
Night, John.
Yeah, good night.
Good night.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome, brother. I thank you.
Great show.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Good to have a good turnout.
Yeah, you know, I'm so glad John could make it because, you know, it's him, it's Rhett, it's LeBron that have such depth of knowledge of the period. And I thought, man, you're going to really connect. And my challenge would be to know when not to interrupt, as little interest as I might have in it, because there's a conversation happening. And I just enjoyed the whole interaction and the sharing and I'm just very full. I just thank you guys so much for allowing me to make this happen. This is just, you know, this is about as joyful as it gets. It's my second love.
And John, you're the one that did the other drawing. I think the other proper drawing of the Texas.
Right. Yeah, you showed my drawing at the beginning.
Exactly. You're where did you know about the green on the frame?
It was a standard Patterson thing. Rogers, Danforth, and New Jersey, they all painted their frames green. For that matter, so did Baldwin up through the end of the Civil War.
I'll be darned. And see, when they were cleaning the frame down, there was some green underneath layers of paint, and that puzzled me. And I had heard that about green frames before, but I didn't realize that they did it to all of them as they build them as kind of a standard feature. But I did know that the other drawing, some of the piping and striping was very accurate, but the white frame was not accurate. I felt that way for sure. But I appreciate that. That's awesome. I'm glad you had that information. So I've got to change a bunch of engines now on my layout. Thanks.
Well, I got to change my drawings now because you provided me with a lot of new information.
Your stuff's beautiful.
That's saying something, David.
I tell you, I appreciate it. I really do. Anything coming from you guys is an absolute reward to hear because I respect what you all have done and what you've learned. You guys have probably forgotten more about this stuff than I'll ever know. So I really appreciate your time.
So since you guys are here, I'll give you a heads up that, you know, David, you can tell is really connected, knows some things that we don't know. So I already have an agreement with him that if he finds like something of the period that I have first dibs. So just so you know, we've already got that in place. So you can jump in, but you're number 2 or whatever. You ain't number 1.
If y'all got 1 extra minute, I'll get something to show you just to brag about.
Sure.
I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
Wow.
Well, Tom, you can have first dibs and all that since I model the Centennial.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, there was a fella that came on, Robert, what was his last name? I think you were on, DC, when he was telling us he has an HO scale Civil War layout.
Yeah,
Do you remember his last name? Was it Smith?
Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm
That's
like,
hard name
okay,
to remember.
right, right. That's right. You guys were on when I told him he's going to be hooked up, right? Yes.
Actually, while we're waiting,
John?
Hello?
Yeah, John, were you going to say something?
No, that was
Yeah,
Edward.
Gotcha.
yep.
All right, you still with me?
Yep.
This is not being broadcast, correct?
No.
Okay. This, gentlemen, is an original 1862 Richmond rifle.
If you click on your view button and hit speaker, he'll come in bigger.
Yeah.
Do what now? Click on.
Go ahead. No, we got you. That's for our viewing, not you.
We're
Okay.
just pulling you up.
Wow.
I'm cheating with 3 monitors. That's why I'm sort of like looking this way and not at here.
Right. All the proper stampings. One of the neatest things about it that I thought was interesting, if you notice in the side of the stock, I'll try to get this at the best angle as I can. Get it down here where I can show it. I hope you can see this.
The notch?
Yep. See that right there?
Yep.
That's where a barrel hit it, where they were hand-to-hand fighting.
Where'd you get that?
An older gentleman came in. I used to own a gun store, and an older gentleman come in one day and said, "I understand you like the Civil War." And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I got something you need to own." And he said, "I'm not gonna argue about it. I want $1,000 for it." I said, "Well, what is it?" "It's a rifle." I said, "Bring it, let me see it." And he walked in a day or two later, it's marked there CS Richmond. And I said, "Well, we got a problem." He said, "What's that?" I said, "It's worth way more than $1,000. He said, "Yeah, but I want $1,000 for it."
Wow.
And that's
Oh, yeah, I
got
see that. Yeah,
his initials carved into the stock. I don't know if you can see it here. Let's do
Right.
this.
saw that. We
Yeah.
saw that.
So that is probably my most prized possession,
Dang.
next to my.
Get it. I get it. I get it. Thanks for sharing that.
And when you
Well done,
realize and how much that equipment weighed, that is impressive. Them young fellows walk around the field with that.
So I think Ed was there something you wanted to share with us, Ed?
Yeah. As I said before, that modeling the Centennial and all that, and right now I'm sort of like just doing like dioramas just to get my skill together.
That's good looking, man.
Well, thank you.
Killing it.
Now the interesting thing is that the guardrails are actually standard gauge. These rails are 6 foot.
Oh, wow.
okay.
So wait a minute. I got a question.
Sure.
Was that what guardrails? They didn't
I
use
didn't
those so
think
much
they
on
used
bridges, did they? Back then?
I honestly don't know. I just put them on there because, well, I thought they belonged on there, and also so I could turn around and put a locomotive on there to make it at least
Yeah, yeah. I think the whole thing looks pretty. So you got to do that as a layout. Is that that's a practice piece versus it's a segment for your layout.
yeah. Well, right now my layout doesn't have room for a bridge.
Got it.
But I wound up buying a bridge and then following on New Track's modeling on how to how to put one together. And the reason why I went with eventually wound up going with this with broad gauge is because the bridge is made by Hunterline.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually in the instructions saying that the 3-foot narrow gauge, when they first started building the kits, their narrow gauge kit is actually full size proper standard gauge. However, the National ACWRRHS Association, they have the everything's a little bit wider, so so they can go around sharper turns and stuff like that. So the loading gauge for HO scale is actually wider. So I made some measurements and all that and figured out that a 6-foot gauge would work fine with this. I also got, I don't have it with me right now, but I also have one that's the cover bridge version, which is also done. So the 6-foot gauge.
Cool.
So
Very nice, man.
Thank you. And
very nice work.
That's why I'm slowly learning on how to handle a track, because, well, they don't make track. It's 1 millimeter narrower than S gauge.
Oh my God. I'm already like brain blown. So gentlemen,
Wow.
I got an early day tomorrow, and thanks for hanging out. This was always a fun part of our segment. So take care, guys. See you next time.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks
See
again,
ya.
David.
Thank you for putting this on, Tom.
Appreciate you.
Most welcome.
Well, there's a way to turn. There it is. Leave.
That was remarkable.
Yeah, well, that was one of our better ones.
I mean, we got a fraction of his knowledge. He has this whole idea about how sand facilities existed back then. These little details around operations that I've just begun to tap. So I was thinking the next one might be talk about the railroad and how it operated such that it would be relevant for a modeler. And then I'll collaborate with him to translate what he's got. And that could be a fun Zoom. Cool.
I think you get a lot of attendees.
Yeah.
This was a good one, though.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, we lasted past 10.
I know. Yeah, it was cool. I was so glad John was here.
Ron was on for a while.
Who?
Ron Flowers.
Yeah, it was great. He was on for most of it, I think. I think I'm going to call him this weekend just to check in with him.
I sent him a text earlier in this evening asking how he and his family were doing.
What'd he say?
I haven't heard back yet. But he was on the call.
Maybe I shouldn't call.
Excuse me.
I shouldn't call him then. Right?
You can call him.
Okay, good.
You think of it this way. It's like with Chip and
right.
Christopher.
Right.
There's a certain things are happening and bad things happen in our lives, and if we can help support each other, that's a good thing.
Right. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate you, DC. Have a good evening, pal. Talk to you soon.
Okay, you too. Take care.